October 3rd, 2004. The autumn sun filtered through Venetian blinds of a Beverly Hills home, casting zebra-striped shadows across hardwood floors. In the master bedroom, Jeanette Leigh, Hollywood's golden girl, the woman whose scream had terrified millions, lay in peaceful repose at 77, her platinum blonde hair, now silvered with age, spread delicately across the pillow like spun moonlight. The star who had once danced with Fred Astaire and charmed audiences worldwide was drawing her final breaths. But even in these quiet moments, there was something that haunted the room. A tension that seemed to whisper of showers and shadows, of a scream that had echoed through cinema history for 44 years. Her daughter, Jamie Lee Curtis, sat vigil by the bedside, watching as her mother's chest rose and fell with increasing difficulty. Around them, walls were adorned with photographs spanning 6 decades of stardom. Janet laughing with Cary Grant, dancing with Fred Astaire, accepting awards. Yet conspicuously absent were any images from the film that had defined her most, Alfred Hitchcock's Psycho. It was as if she had spent her entire life trying to escape that motel bathroom, that fateful shower scene that had made her immortal and imprisoned her simultaneously. The official cause of death would be listed as vasculitis, clean, medical, simple. But those who knew Jeanette Leigh understood that something far more complex had been slowly consuming her for decades. The weight of being forever frozen in a moment of terror. The burden of a 45-second scene that had overshadowed a career spanning 50 films and 30 years. As news of her passing spread, tributes poured in from every corner of the industry. But strangely, almost every obituary began the same way. Jeanette Leigh, star of Alfred Hitchcock's Psycho. It was as if her entire life had been condensed into those few terrifying moments when Marion Crane met her end at the Bates Motel. Even in death, she couldn't escape the shower. The irony was palpable and heartbreaking. Here was a woman who had appeared opposite Hollywood's greatest leading men, who had sung and danced her way through MGM musicals, who had tackled everything from westerns to film noir with equal grace. Yet when the world said goodbye to Jeanette Leigh, they were really saying goodbye to a scream, the most famous scream in cinema history. What if the woman behind that legendary moment of terror had been hiding secrets and pain that went far deeper than any movie role? But to understand how it all ended, we must first understand how it all began. In a small Midwestern town where a young girl named Jeanette Morrison dreamed of something bigger, never knowing that her greatest triumph would also become her most beautiful curse. The year was 1927, and America was dancing on the precipice of change. In a modest 2-story house in Merced, California, a baby girl took her first breath. Jeanette Helen Morrison entered the world on July 6th. To parents who embodied the hard-working spirit of Middle America. Her father, Frederick Morrison, was an insurance agent of steady habits and modest dreams. Her mother, Helen Leigh, had once harbored performing aspirations before settling into devoted motherhood. But from the very beginning, there was something different about little Jeanette. Even as a toddler, she possessed an ethereal quality that seemed to capture light itself. Her platinum blonde hair caught sunbeams like spun gold, and her large, expressive eyes held a depth that seemed otherworldly in someone so young. Neighbors would stop to comment on the Morrison child's unusual beauty, often telling Helen that her daughter belonged in pictures. It was praise that would prove prophetic, though perhaps not in the way anyone intended. The Morrison household was one of discipline and aspiration. Frederick, having struggled through the economic uncertainties of the 1920s, instilled in his daughter the importance of education and self-reliance. He would often tell young Jeanette, "Beauty fades, but a sharp mind lasts forever." Helen, meanwhile, nurtured her daughter's natural grace, enrolling her in dance and music lessons from an early age. Could these early experiences of being constantly observed, constantly praised for her appearance, have planted the seeds for both her future success and her later struggles with identity? Even as a child, Jeanette seemed to understand that she was different, that people looked at her with a kind of hungry fascination that made her both proud and uncomfortable. By the time she was 10, Jeanette had grown into a striking child who moved with innate elegance that seemed to come from somewhere beyond her small-town upbringing. Her teachers at Merced High School noted not just her academic excellence, but also her ability to command attention without seeming to try. During school plays and local talent shows, she would take the stage with confidence that belied her years. But there were darker undercurrents to this picture-perfect childhood. The Great Depression had arrived with devastating force, and even steady Frederick Morrison felt its bite. The family was forced to take in boarders to make ends meet. Jeanette watched her parents whisper in worried tones about money, about the future, about whether they would be able to keep their home. It was during this period of financial strain that something shifted in young Jeanette's psyche. She began to understand that her beauty might be more than just a genetic gift. It might be a lifeline. She started paying closer attention to movie magazines, studying the faces of Jean Harlow and Carole Lombard with scholarly intensity. Was this when the dream began to form, or was it when the trap was first laid? As she moved through her teenage years, excelling in studies while participating in every drama production, Jeanette began to develop what would later become her signature quality as an actress: the ability to project vulnerability and strength simultaneously. Perhaps most tellingly, even in those early performances, Jeanette seemed drawn to roles that required her to portray characters in distress. Beautiful but threatened, perfect but fragile. It was as if she was unconsciously preparing for the role that would define her life, though the bathroom at the Bates Motel was still more than a decade away. The summer of 1946 shimmered with possibility as 18-year-old Jeanette Morrison prepared to leave her small-town life behind for university. She had chosen to study psychology, driven by a fascination with human behavior that would later serve her well. But fate had other plans. It was her father, Frederick, who first noticed the envelope in their mailbox, elegant cream-colored paper that stood out among the usual bills. Inside was something that would change everything. A letter from Norma Shearer, the legendary MGM star who had seen a photograph of Jeanette, taken at her high school graduation and published in a local paper. And something about the young woman's face had stopped her cold. "There's a quality of light in her eyes," Shearer would later tell MGM executives, "something that can't be taught or manufactured. She has the look of a star." The letter was an invitation that felt like destiny calling. Would Jeanette be interested in a screen test at Metro-Goldwyn-Mayer Studios? The Morrison family sat around their kitchen table that evening, the letter spread before them like a treasure map to another world. Frederick worried about Hollywood's dangers for a young woman barely out of high school. Helen felt excitement mixed with protective fear. But Jeanette herself felt something else entirely, a recognition, as if this moment had been waiting for her all along. The train ride to Los Angeles in August 1946 was a journey between worlds. Walking through those legendary MGM gates past the iconic Leo the Lion logo, Jeanette felt as if she were entering a dream made manifest. The lot buzzed with activity. Actors in costume moving between sound stages, directors shouting instructions, the constant hum of creativity and ambition that made Hollywood the most intoxicating place on earth. The screen test captured something remarkable: natural grace and emotional authenticity that couldn't be faked. When the test footage was screened for executives later that week, the room fell silent. "Sign her immediately," was the verdict from Louis B. Mayer himself. But there was one condition. Jeanette Morrison was a beautiful name for a small-town girl, but it wasn't star material. After much deliberation, they settled on Janet Leigh, keeping her first name similar enough that she would still recognize it: but creating a surname that was sleek, modern, and memorable. Was this the moment when Jeanette Morrison truly died and Janet Leigh was born? The contract she signed that September was standard for the time, 7 years at $50 a week with options for the studio to renew or drop her at their discretion. She was now the property of MGM. Her first film role came in 1947 with The Romance of Rosie Ridge. Though small, Janet approached it with dedication that would become her trademark. The film was a modest success, and Janet's performance earned critical notice for its natural charm and screen presence. Hollywood Reporter wrote, "Janet Leigh brings a freshness to the screen that reminds us why we fell in love with movies in the first place." It was the beginning of what seemed like a fairy tale ascent to stardom. The late 1940s and early 1950s belonged to Janet Leigh in a way that few stars could claim. At MGM, she had become the studio's golden girl, their answer to every director's dream of the perfect leading lady. She possessed that rare combination of ethereal beauty and dramatic range that could elevate any production from ordinary to extraordinary. Her platinum blonde hair had become as iconic as her smile. By 1949, Janet was earning $1,500 per week, a fortune for a 22-year-old, and living in a Beverly Hills mansion that seemed lifted from Hollywood fairy tales. The films came in rapid succession, each one designed to showcase a different facet of her talent. In Little Women, she played Meg March with warmth that made audiences forget they were watching a performance. That Forsyte woman paired her with Greer Garson and demonstrated her ability to hold her own against established dramatic actresses. Yet behind the glamorous facade, Janet was beginning to understand the true cost of perfection. Every aspect of her life was now managed by the studio. What she wore, where she went, who she was seen with, even what she said in interviews. The spontaneous, authentic young woman from Merced was slowly being replaced by a carefully constructed image that bore her name, but felt increasingly foreign to her soul. The turning point came in 1951 when she met Tony Curtis at a Universal Studios party. He was the studio's rising bad boy, a Bronx-born rebel who wore his leather jacket like armor. Where Janet was all grace and refinement, Tony was raw energy and dangerous charm. They were opposites in every way that mattered, which perhaps explains why they fell in love with an intensity that bordered on obsession. Their courtship played out like a real-life Hollywood romance. When they married on June 4, 1951, Janet wore a simple cream-colored dress and carried white orchids. For a brief, shining moment, it seemed as if Janet Leigh had managed to have it all: career success, financial security, and true love. The couple became Hollywood royalty, their combined star power making them the most photographed couple in America. But beneath the surface, cracks were already beginning to show. Tony's ambition burned with a different intensity than Janet's careful professionalism. Janet found herself increasingly typecast in roles that played to her beauty rather than her talent. She was the perfect wife, the ideal woman, the flawless leading lady, but she was starting to feel like she was disappearing inside her own image. Behind all that glamour was there an unbearable loneliness that nobody saw. Even surrounded by the trappings of success, even married to one of Hollywood's most desirable men, Janet sometimes felt like she was living someone else's life. As the 1950s progressed, Janet Leigh found herself at a crossroads she hadn't anticipated. She had climbed to the very pinnacle of Hollywood success, but the view from the top was not what she had expected. The question that began to haunt her quiet moments was one that would define the rest of her career. Was being perfect worth the cost of never being allowed to be anything else? The first crack appeared in 1958, a hairline fracture in the perfect facade that Janet and Tony had presented to the world. It started with whispers, Rumors of arguments behind closed doors, of Tony's wandering eye, of Janet's growing dissatisfaction with the golden cage that fame had built around her. Tony's career was ascending to new heights with films like Some Like It Hot, where his comedic chemistry with Jack Lemmon and Marilyn Monroe proved he was more than just a pretty face. Janet, meanwhile, was struggling with the increasing predictability of her roles. Beautiful women in beautiful settings wearing beautiful clothes but rarely getting to explore the deeper, darker aspects of human nature that truly interested her as an actress. The birth of their daughter Kelly in 1956, followed by Jamie Lee in 1958, should have brought them closer together. The photographs from this period show Janet in a new light, softer, more maternal, genuinely happy in moments when she wasn't performing for the cameras. She threw herself into motherhood with the same dedication she brought to her film roles. But even the joy of motherhood couldn't completely heal the growing rift in her marriage. Tony's increasing absences left Janet feeling isolated despite being surrounded by the trappings of success. She began to question whether the life she had built was truly her own, or simply an elaborate performance that had gotten out of hand. It was during this period of personal uncertainty that fate intervened in the form of a phone call that would alter the trajectory of Janet's life forever. Alfred Hitchcock, the master of suspense, was preparing his next project, a small black-and-white thriller based on a novel by Robert Bloch called Psycho. The story was unlike anything Hitchcock had attempted before. Where his previous films had featured glamorous stars in exotic locations, Psycho was set in a seedy roadside motel and centered around characters who inhabited the darker margins of society. It was a risky project that the major studios had rejected, forcing Hitchcock to finance it independently. When Hitchcock approached Janet about playing Marion Crane, the role seemed almost insultingly small for an actress of her stature. Marion appears in only the first third of the film before meeting her shocking end in the infamous shower scene. Most leading ladies would have turned down such a brief part, but something about the project intrigued Janet. The role of Marion Crane was unlike any Janet had played before. Marion is a woman driven to desperation by financial pressures and romantic frustration, who makes the impulsive decision to steal $40,000 from her employer and flee to California. She's not a traditional leading lady. She's morally ambiguous, psychologically complex, and ultimately vulnerable in ways that most Hollywood heroines never were. Hitchcock saw something in Janet that other directors had missed or ignored, a capacity for portraying genuine fear and desperation beneath her polished exterior. During their first meeting, he told her, "I don't want Janet Leigh, the movie star. I want to see the woman behind the image, the one who understands what it means to feel trapped." The decision to accept the role in Psycho was not made lightly. Janet's agents advised against it, arguing that appearing in a low-budget horror film would damage her carefully cultivated image. Tony was similarly skeptical. But something deeper was calling to her, a voice that had been suppressed beneath years of playing perfect women in perfect situations. Marion Crane represented everything Janet had never been allowed to be on screen: desperate, flawed, real. When filming began in the winter of 1959, Janet threw herself into the role with an intensity that surprised even Hitchcock. The shower scene itself was filmed over 7 days, with Janet spending hours in various states of undress while Hitchcock and his crew captured every angle of what would become cinema's most famous murder. The experience was physically and emotionally exhausting, requiring Janet to access levels of terror and vulnerability that she had never before displayed on screen. But none of them could have predicted what they were creating. They thought they were making a small experimental thriller. Instead, they were crafting a moment in cinema history that would define not just the horror genre, but the very nature of how audiences related to film. Did this tragic event mark their downfall, Or was it simply the tipping point of deeper problems? For Janet, Psycho represented both the pinnacle of her artistic achievement and the beginning of a struggle for identity that would last the rest of her life. June 16, 1960. The DeMille Theater in New York City buzzed with electric tension. This was the premiere of Alfred Hitchcock's Psycho, and despite the film's modest budget and controversial subject matter, anticipation had reached fever pitch. Janet Leigh sat in the darkened theater, her heart pounding as she watched herself on screen, knowing that in just minutes the world would witness Marion Crane's shocking death and her own transformation from Hollywood starlet to cinematic icon. The first third of the film played exactly as she remembered shooting it. Marion's desperation, her theft of the money, her flight into the darkness toward the Bates Motel. Janet watched herself perform with a vulnerability and authenticity she had never been allowed to display before. This was not the polished, perfect Janet Leigh of MGM musicals. This was a woman raw with fear and guilt, beautiful but deeply flawed. And then came the moment that would change everything. The shower scene unfolded with a precision and brutality that was unlike anything audiences had ever experienced. 45 seconds, 78 camera cuts, the sound of the knife, the swirling water, the blood circling the drain. And at the center of it all, Janet's face, eyes wide with terror, mouth open in a scream that seemed to tear itself from her very soul. The audience's reaction was immediate and visceral. Women screamed, men gasped, several people actually fled the theater. The death of Marion Crane wasn't just shocking because it was violent. It was shocking because it broke every rule of cinematic storytelling. The star, the character audiences had been following and sympathizing with, was dead just 40 minutes into the film. Psycho grossed over $60 million worldwide, an enormous sum for a low-budget black-and-white thriller. It spawned countless imitators and established many of the conventions that would define the horror genre for decades to come. The shower scene became a cultural touchstone, referenced and parodied in everything from comedy sketches to high art installations. But for Janet personally, the success of Psycho came with an unexpected and devastating cost. Almost overnight, she discovered that audiences could no longer see her as anyone other than Marion Crane. The sophisticated leading lady of Touch of Evil and the Manchurian Candidate had been replaced in the public consciousness by the woman who died screaming in a motel shower. The typecasting was swift and merciless. Suddenly, every script that came her way seemed to feature women in peril, characters who existed primarily to be terrorized or murdered. Directors who had once seen her as a versatile dramatic actress now viewed her through the lens of Psycho, unable to imagine her in roles that didn't exploit the fear and vulnerability she had displayed so memorably. More troubling still was the personal impact of the film's success. Janet began to notice that people looked at her differently on the street, in restaurants, at Hollywood parties. There was a new quality to their gaze, a mixture of fascination and something approaching voyeurism. They weren't just seeing Janet Leigh, the actress. They were seeing the woman who had been murdered on screen. The effect on her marriage to Tony Curtis was equally devastating. While her career became defined by a single scene of victimization, his continued to flourish with increasingly diverse and challenging roles. The imbalance created a tension that their relationship couldn't survive. The most painful aspect of her new fame was the way it seemed to diminish everything else she had accomplished. Decades of professional achievement were reduced to 45 seconds of terror. The psychological impact was perhaps the most profound. Janet later confessed to close friends what the shower scene had cost her personally. "I stopped taking showers. I couldn't do it anymore. The sound of the water, the enclosed space, the vulnerability. It all brought me back to that bathroom at the Bates Motel. For months I could only take baths, and even then I would lock the door and check it 3 times. The irony was devastating. The scene that had made her famous had stolen from her one of life's most basic comforts. Every day she was reminded of Marion Crane's death through something as simple as trying to get clean. Can anyone ever truly escape from the shadow of their darkest moments? For Jeanette Leigh, Psycho had created a shadow that seemed to grow longer and darker with each passing year. The film that had given her the best role of her career had also, in many ways, ended that career by making it impossible for audiences to see her as anyone other than Marion Crane. The years following Psycho were a study in the strange alchemy of fame, how a single moment of artistic triumph can become both a blessing and a curse. Jeanette Leigh found herself caught in a psychological maze that mirrored the twisted corridors of the Bates house, searching for an exit that seemed to recede further with each step she took toward normalcy. The effect on her relationship with Tony Curtis was profound and destructive. While she was struggling with the psychological aftermath of Psycho, their marriage was crumbling under the weight of 2 careers pulling in different directions. The final blow came in 1962 when Tony began an affair with his Taras Bulba co-star Christine Kaufman. The betrayal was devastating not just because of the infidelity, but because it seemed to confirm Janet's worst fears about herself. That success in Psycho had somehow diminished her as a woman. Their divorce was finalized in 1962, ending what had been one of Hollywood's most celebrated marriages. Janet had lost not just her husband, but the last vestige of the life she had built before Psycho changed everything. Professionally, Janet threw herself into work with determination that bordered on desperation. She appeared in films like The Manchurian Candidate, where her complex portrayal showed flashes of her true dramatic range. But even positive reviews carried the inevitable comparison to her most famous role. Critics couldn't seem to discuss her performances without referencing the shower scene. The most painful aspect of this period was watching her daughters grow up under the shadow of her fame. Kelly and Jamie Lee Curtis were constantly asked about their mother's most famous scene, forced to navigate a world where their family name was synonymous with fictional murder. Can anyone ever truly escape from the shadow of their darkest moments? The challenge now was learning to live with that legacy, to find a way to honor what she had accomplished while also reclaiming her identity from Marion Crane's death. The 1970s arrived like a second chance. At 43, Jeanette Leigh was no longer the golden girl of MGM's Dream Factory, but she was finally free to discover who she might become beyond the shadow of Marion Crane's death. For the first time in decades, Janet felt the possibility of reinvention. Her divorce from Tony Curtis, while painful, had also been liberating. She was no longer half of a Hollywood power couple, no longer required to maintain the facade of perfect marriage. Her daughters were growing into independent young women, and the constant pressure of public scrutiny had diminished. In 1968, she found love again with Robert Brandt, a stockbroker who existed entirely outside the entertainment industry. Bob represented everything that Hollywood was not: stable, private, grounded in reality rather than fantasy. He had never seen Psycho when they met, a fact that initially shocked Janet but ultimately delighted her. Here was someone who could love her without the filter of Marion Crane's scream. Their marriage in 1969 marked the beginning of what Janet would later describe as the happiest period of her adult life. With Bob's support, Janet began to approach her career with a new philosophy. Rather than fighting against the typecasting that Psycho had created, she chose to embrace it while simultaneously subverting it. She accepted roles in horror films and thrillers, but she insisted on playing characters who were strong rather than merely victimized. More importantly, Janet began to find her voice as a writer. She had always been intelligent and articulate, but the demands of her career had never allowed her to explore these qualities fully. Now she began working on what would become her memoir, allowing her to reclaim her own narrative. Perhaps the most significant change in Janet's life during this period was her relationship with her daughters, particularly Jamie Lee Curtis, who was beginning her own acting career. When Jamie Lee was cast in John Carpenter's Halloween in 1978, Janet experienced a complex mixture of emotions. Jamie Lee's iconic performance as Laurie Strode made her an instant star, but also established her as the next generation's scream queen. The parallel was both touching and troubling. Mother and daughter had both found fame through fear. Both had been defined by their ability to convey terror and vulnerability on screen. But where Janet had stumbled into the horror genre accidentally, Jamie Lee seemed to embrace it deliberately, finding empowerment in playing women who fought back against their tormentors. Were these final decisions acts of surrender, or courageous acts of self-preservation? For Janet, the choice to step back from the relentless pursuit of stardom and embrace a quieter, more authentic life represented perhaps the bravest decision of her career. She was choosing to define herself rather than allowing herself to be defined by others. The autumn years of Janet Leigh's life unfolded with grace and dignity that had been hard-won through decades of public scrutiny and personal struggle. As the 1990s dawned, she found herself in the unique position of being both a living legend and a woman who had finally made peace with the complexities of her own story. At 63, she was no longer running from the shadow of Marion Crane. Instead, she had learned to live within it while refusing to be diminished by it. Her marriage to Robert Brandt had provided the stability and normalcy that her earlier life had lacked. Their Beverly Hills home was a sanctuary decorated not with glamorous excess, but with warmth and comfort that reflected a life fully lived. The walls were lined with books rather than movie posters, family photographs rather than publicity stills. Janet's relationship with Psycho had evolved into something approaching reconciliation. She could now speak about the film and her experience making it with a perspective that combined professional pride with personal understanding of its cost. When film scholars and journalists approached her for interviews, she was generous with her time and insights. But she also insisted on discussing her other work and her life beyond that single role. In 1995, she published Psycho: Behind the Scenes of the Classic Thriller, a detailed account of making the film that became essential reading for cinema students and Hitchcock enthusiasts. The book was both a professional memoir and a form of therapy, allowing Janet to examine the experience that had defined her career with the wisdom of hindsight. "That shower scene never ended for me," she wrote in one particularly revealing passage. "It became my shadow, following me everywhere I went. But I've learned that shadows are only frightening when you run from them. When you turn to face them, they become simply part of the landscape of your life." The book's success led to a meaningful renaissance in Janet's public profile. She appeared on talk shows and at film festivals, finally able to discuss Psycho without the pain that had made such conversations difficult for decades. Younger audiences, many of whom knew her primarily through her daughter Jamie Lee's career, discovered the depth and range of her earlier work. As the new millennium approached, Janet found herself increasingly interested in legacy. Not just her own, but the broader legacy of Hollywood's golden age. She became involved with film preservation efforts, understanding that the movies that had shaped her life were in danger of being lost to time and neglect. Her health remained good well into her 70s, allowing her to enjoy travel with Bob and time with her grandchildren. The diagnosis of vasculitis came in 2003, a year before her death. Janet faced the illness with the same grace she had brought to every other challenge in her life, refusing to let it diminish her dignity. Were these final decisions acts of surrender, or courageous acts of self-preservation? Perhaps they were both. The recognition that some battles cannot be won only survived with dignity intact. Jeanette Leigh had spent decades learning to live with an image that was both blessing and burden, and in the end, she had found a way to honor both the woman she had been and the legend she had become. The world lost Jeanette Leigh on October 3, 2004, but the circumstances surrounding her death were as peaceful as her final years had been. She died at Cedars-Sinai Medical Center in Beverly Hills, surrounded by family. Her passing marked by the same dignity that had characterized her approach to both triumph and adversity throughout her remarkable 77 years. Within hours, tributes began pouring in from colleagues, fans, and critics who recognized that they were mourning not just an actress, but an era. The Jeanette Leigh who died that autumn day was the last living link to a Hollywood that existed only in black and white photographs, and the collective memory of a generation that was itself passing into history. Jamie Lee Curtis, in her first public statement following her mother's death, captured something essential about Janet's legacy. "My mother was many things: a movie star, a loving wife and mother, a survivor. But perhaps most importantly, she was a woman who refused to be defined by any single moment, no matter how famous that moment became." The tributes that followed reflected the complex nature of Janet's impact on popular culture. Film scholars praised her contribution to cinema history, noting that the shower scene in Psycho had fundamentally altered the relationship between audiences and movies. Horror fans honored her as the original Scream Queen, the template for countless actresses who would follow in her footsteps. The funeral, held at Westwood Village Memorial Park, was a study in the kind of dignity that had marked Janet's approach to her entire career. The service was private, attended only by family and close friends, reflecting her preference for authenticity over spectacle. Jamie Lee delivered the eulogy, speaking with the poise and humor that she had inherited from her mother. She spoke of Janet's courage in facing the unexpected consequences of Psycho, her resilience in rebuilding her life after divorce, and her wisdom in choosing love and family over the relentless pursuit of fame. As the casket was lowered into the ground, a sudden wind stirred the California air, rustling the leaves of the towering eucalyptus trees that surrounded the cemetery. For just a moment, the sound resembled nothing so much as the whisper of water running through pipes, an echo perhaps of the shower at the Bates Motel that had made her immortal. But this time it wasn't terror. It was release. The mystery that surrounded Jeanette Leigh was not one of conspiracy or hidden secrets, but something more profound. The enigma of how a single performance lasting less than an hour could resonate so powerfully across generations and cultures. Perhaps the answer lay in Janet's own understanding of what she had accomplished. In her final interview, she reflected on the strange alchemy that had created the shower scene. "I think people respond to it because it's real in a way that most movie deaths aren't. There's no heroic posturing, no noble last words. Marion dies as people actually die, suddenly, violently, unfairly. Was their death as straightforward as reported? Or were powerful hidden forces involved? In Jeanette Leigh's case, there were no hidden forces, no mysterious circumstances, no unanswered questions. Her death was as honest and straightforward as the life she had chosen to live in her later years. The only mystery was the one that surrounds all great art, how a moment of fictional terror could become a source of real comfort, how a performance born from vulnerability could become a symbol of strength. At Westwood Memorial, as Jeanette Leigh was laid to rest, the wind stirred through the eucalyptus trees, whispering like water through pipes. For a moment, it sounded like the shower she could never escape, but this time, it wasn't terror. It was release. The scream had ended. The echo remained and always would, not as a prison, but as proof that some moments of truth are powerful enough to outlive the people who create them. The woman who had once complained that she couldn't take a shower alone had, in the end, made peace with the bathroom at the Bates Motel. She had learned to live with her legend without being diminished by it, to honor her most famous role without being imprisoned by it. The scream that had made her famous had finally ended. But the echo of her courage, her professionalism, and her humanity would continue to resonate for generations to come, inspiring new artists to face their own fears with the same fearless honesty that Jeanette Leigh had brought to that legendary shower so many years ago. And perhaps that's the question we should all ask ourselves when our greatest achievements become our most defining moments. Do we have the courage to embrace them without losing who we truly are? Jeanette Leigh found that courage. The question is, can we?